But now that we've all tapped into our why, let's take a closer look at um, why the science, why SOAR is important. And it's really just three main things. Explains that crazy behavior, reduces stigma, blame, and anger, and promotes and supports recovery. So this information is going to explain that crazy behavior we see that doesn't make any sense. It explains those promises from our loved ones and our friends that they say we're not going to drink, we're not going to use, and they seem so sincere, and then there they are, drunk or high again. It's going to reduce stigma, and it already has stigma, blame, and anger, helping us not to take personally the behavior of a person in active addiction, as we learn that recovery is an ongoing process. And it also promotes recovery. This information has given common ground to talk about the recovery process. It has informed messaging, how we message and speak about substance use disorder. And I want to invite you to that training on March 25th. It'll be an hour and a half, so there'll be more on that later. And it has also helped us with advocacy, with speaking out and changing those laws that I referred to in the very beginning. And I guess in a nutshell, SOAR is important because it promotes healing on so many levels for people with substance use disorder. And so I had no idea that I had a health condition when I was steeped in my addiction. I never thought of it like that. I thought I was the black sheep of my family. I thought I was a loser. And I don't know if any of you have ever thought of yourselves like that if you are in recovery. But what we now know is that addiction is a chronic disease, similar to other chronic diseases like diabetes or hypertension or heart disease or asthma. And I've given you some key takeaways on page 3 of your workbook. And one of those key takeaways is that, like other chronic health conditions, addiction and recovery affect our body, our brain, our mind, and that behavior that you see. Another key takeaway, recovery, just like other health conditions, requires chronic management, long-term management, support, and care. And we haven't always known that. And it wasn't always thought of that way. So because of that, there are still a lot of attitudes that persist. And I've shared a couple words that come up on page 3, but I'd like you to stop and think about what are some of the attitudes you have experienced, either as a person in recovery or maybe a person with a loved one with substance use disorder, or maybe somebody you're serving in your job, and put that on your workbook or maybe in the chat. I'm gonna give you just a minute to think about that. Those people. I'm going to read some of them as I see them. Thought of it as a weakness, a moral failing, like we were choosing it, right? Anything else come up for anyone they want to share in the chat? It's a cult. Wow. Kind of adding to the stigma, wouldn't you say? Not taking responsibility. They're so irresponsible. I gave you a great example of an irresponsible mother in my intro. And blaming, a lot of victims, right? Doesn't help our cause. Waiting for it to just stop, maybe tomorrow. So all of you are posting great examples of some of the attitudes about substance use disorder, attitudes that are warranted, attitudes that we worked hard to earn, but they are contributing to the stigma that still surrounds substance users to this day. And notice I said substance users and not abusers. I'm trying to stay away from language that is stigmatizing. I hope you hear me try to do that today. I was steeped in shame and guilt. I thought I was worth less. But I want to ask you this. When I or you took that very first drug or drink, was it because you were morally bankrupt? I mean, why did we do that? Well, what they find, why people use, it boils down to just a few reasons, and it's to feel good, sensation seeking. And by the way, this is on page 4 of your workbook, and there's a fill-in there. Or it's to feel better. A lot of times we are self-medicating, and I had a history of depression, and I'm sure that contributed to my use. Sometimes it's to do better, maybe in school, or maybe it's curiosity and social peer pressure. So those are the reasons. And the bottom line is, what happens is we like what it does to our brains. So I'm going to ask you, how does trying to be, do, or feel better end up, for some of us, in full-blown addiction? And to have that conversation, I first want to start by getting clear on what we mean by addiction. And so I'm going to ask you to turn to, if you're not already there, page 4. Now, there's a lot of words on this slide, but I'm going to bring it to life for you. So what is addiction? What is substance use disorder? And this comes from the American Society for Addiction Medicine. And here's some of the words that will make this come to life. So it's a treatable, a chronic medical disease, and it involves complex interactions between our brain circuits, our genetics, our environment, our life experiences. When we have addiction, no matter the substance, we are engaging in behaviors that are compulsive. So they're not even getting to the rational part of our thinking brain. We're compulsively behaving, and we're going to continue that behavior despite the harmful consequences. I mentioned some of those, like bankruptcy. I almost had my son taken by foster care. Those are pretty harmful consequences, and I continue to use. But the good news, prevention efforts and treatment are just as successful generally as those for other chronic diseases. And again, we haven't always known this. Now, you may have heard other definitions of addiction, but let's move forward with this definition so that as we ask, why do people become addicted, some people and not others? Why is that? So we're now going to look, this is on pages 4 and 5. Science is truly evolving here in this discussion. We once thought that it was your environment. Like if your parents use, probably you're going to be more likely to use, and that goes with genes too. They thought maybe it was your genes. That's the root cause. For years, mental health experts believe, well, there's some underlying issue there. And if we just can uncover that, they're probably going to stop using their drug of choice or alcohol. But it turns out that addiction is a mix. It results from a mix of our biology and our genes, our environment, the substance we use and how we use it, and the brain. The brain is a core issue. So we now know that biology, genetics, and the environment all impact neurobiology, the study of the brain, the neurons, the neurotransmitters, and our circuitry all through our body. And MRIs and CT scans have made this brain science possible. So on your workbook on page 5, I'm going to ask you to take a moment and think about your own experience with substance use disorder, whether yourself or with a peer or a loved one. Think about what risk factors contributed to the use or misuse in the person that you love or in yourself that resulted in addiction. And then place that in the chat. And so when I'm seeing self-medicating and wanted to be accepted, I had clients share that they had trauma. We're finding out so much about trauma-informed care. And that contributed to them self-medicating. I see again, trauma, abuse, that's huge. A lack of identity, low self-esteem, cultural norms associated with drinking. People triggered me. Not understanding the risk factors. Thank you so much for sharing this in chat, because we're going to be able to download that and you'll have this as a resource. Substances made me feel normal around my trauma and abuse. Love dancing and dancing with Kamchatka. That's Merlin. Thanks, Merlin. Okay, so what's clear? There's a lot of reasons that people become addicted. And as I said, the science is evolving around this. But what's clear is that the brain is the organ that is changed when addiction occurs. So let's take a closer look at the brain. Now, I don't expect you to leave here a brain scientist, nor am I. But let's think about the magnificence of our brain. It is the most complex organ in our body, and we are on page 6 in your workbook. Your brain regulates your basic body functions, enables us to think, interpret the world around us, all of our experiences. It shapes our behavior. In essence, it's who we are. And it's often likened to an incredibly complex, intricate computer. And that's a fill in the blank in your worksheet. And instead of electrical circuits and silicon chips, instead the brain has billions of cells called neurons, which are organized into circuits and networks. And these networks of neurons are sending signals back and forth to each other among all the different parts of your brain and the spinal cord and the nerves and the rest of the body. And that is how, when we are normal and not on drugs, our brain communicates. So, as I said, neurons are releasing neurotransmitters into that gap in your receptors. And molecules called transporters are then recycling those neurotransmitters, taking them back to the neuron. And that is how there's a homeostasis, there's balance in your brain. And what happens with drugs, you introduce drugs into that beautifully balanced system, and it interferes with the way neurons are able to send, receive, and process signals via the neurotransmitters. Now, as I said, I'm not a brain scientist, so I'm going to have you listen to an expert that'll explain this better than me in about a 3-minute video, so just bear with me.
Addiction is a neurological disorder that affects the reward system in the brain. In a healthy person, the reward system reinforces important behaviors that are essential for survival, such as eating, drinking, sex, and social interaction. For example, the reward system ensures that you reach for food when you are hungry because you know that after eating you will feel good. In other words, it makes the activity of eating pleasurable and memorable, so you would want to do it again and again whenever you feel hungry. Drugs of abuse hijack this system, turning the person's natural needs into drug needs. The brain consists of billions of neurons, or nerve cells, which communicate via chemical messages, or neurotransmitters. When a neuron is sufficiently stimulated, an electrical impulse called an action potential is generated and travels down the axon to the nerve terminal. Here, it triggers the release of a neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, a space between neurons. The neurotransmitter then binds to a receptor on a neighboring neuron, generating a signal in it, thereby transmitting the information to that neuron. The major reward pathways involve transmission of the neurotransmitter dopamine from the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, of the midbrain to the limbic system and the frontal cortex. Engaging in enjoyable activities generates action potentials in dopamine-producing neurons of the VTA. This causes dopamine release from the neurons into the synaptic space. Dopamine then binds to and stimulates dopamine receptor on the receiving neuron. This stimulation by dopamine is believed to produce the pleasurable feelings or rewarding effects. Dopamine molecules are then removed from the synaptic space and transported back into the transmitting neuron by a special protein called dopamine transporter. Most drugs of abuse increase the level of dopamine in the reward pathway. Some drugs such as alcohol, heroin, and nicotine indirectly excite the dopamine-producing neurons in the VTA so that they generate more action potentials. Cocaine acts at the nerve terminal. It binds to dopamine transporter and blocks the reuptake of dopamine. Methamphetamine, a psychostimulant, acts similarly to cocaine in blocking dopamine removal. In addition, it can enter the neuron into the dopamine-containing vesicles, where it triggers dopamine release even in the absence of action potentials. Different drugs act in different ways, but the common outcome is that dopamine builds up in the synapse to a much greater amount than normal. This causes a continuous stimulation, maybe overstimulation of receiving neurons, and is responsible for prolonged and intense euphoria experienced by drug users. Repeated exposure to dopamine surges caused by drugs eventually desensitizes the reward system. The system is no longer responsive to everyday stimuli. The only thing that is rewarding is the drug. That is how drugs change the person's life priority. After some time, even the drug loses its ability to reward, and higher doses are required to achieve the rewarding effect. This ultimately leads to drug overdose. Addiction.
So I hope that that video helped to explain how drugs impact our brain. And just a few more things I want to share. The drugs affect your whole body and your brain, but primarily these four areas: your cortex, your ability to think, your limbic system, how you're motivated to do anything in life, your brain stem, which is breathing and heart rate and sleeping, and your cerebellum. And so I've included that in your workbook as a resource, but here's what I want to focus on. Those neurotransmitters, the two most important ones are dopamine and serotonin. And most of you have probably heard this in some way, shape, or form before, but they are the most impacted by drugs and alcohol. And remember, dopamine is responsible for our motivation, our motor functioning, our ability to feel pleasure. And serotonin is responsible for our feelings of well-being and happiness, our memory processing. So pretty important that drugs are impacting these. And I want to show you in a very telling picture how dopamine levels impact our brain. So, I'm sorry, how dopamine is impacted. So here is a picture, and this is in your workbooks on page 9. Remember, dopamine is good for us. And in a normal brain, we have natural rewards from, say, food or sex. So in this picture, what we're seeing is with natural rewards, dopamine is elevated by food to about 100. We like eating. And maybe chocolate, if that's like your favorite thing, it could go as high as a little over 150 when we see our favorite food. Now, sex can peak at about 200 at its highest. So that's pretty high, right? But let's look at dopamine when we introduce drugs into the system. So, wow, nicotine. Our dopamine levels reach almost 240. No wonder it's hard to quit. Morphine goes above 200 and it lasts for 5 hours. Cocaine, it's going to hit almost 400. And with meth, and this is why aha moment went over 1100. It's no wonder I was driven compulsively to use over and over, and nothing else gave me pleasure. Not even my son, who is the light of my life and the center of my heart. You talk about being hijacked. I was hijacked. And what's more is what happens to our dopamine receptors once we're addicted. So here's another picture, and these are only possible, these brain scans, because of our advances in science. And here's one that shows that dopamine receptors are lower in the addicted brain. And it really didn't matter what drug we're showing. So if red on this scale shows you receptor availability, you can see that with cocaine, meth, alcohol, and heroin, there is not a whole lot of red there. In fact, there's very little, except maybe in alcohol, I see a little bit of red. And why does that matter? Well, it means that dopamine receptors were targeted by drugs, and once addicted, there was reduced dopamine receptors. And what that translates to is an increase in impulsivity. That's that compulsive behavior that we see in the addicted brain. And that leads to further substance use and more risky behaviors. And it's a vicious cycle that's tied now directly to our inability to regulate dopamine. So another thing our research is showing us is how the brain adapts. And this is called neuroplasticity. And it's big word, just the ability of our brain to adapt and change. And we once thought that the brain was fully developed by adulthood, but we now know that's just not true. And throughout life, our brain is reorienting itself, creating new neural pathways depending on the input that's coming in. Well, in addiction, with dopamine being released, that's not only highly rewarding, our brain is learning. And it tells the brain, hey, remember this so you can feel this way again. And after a while, there's no choice. The brain has absolutely remapped itself to make feeding the addiction the most important course of action for our life. So how does tolerance for a substance happen? Well, as that behavior is repeated again and again, the level of dopamine release decreases, as we saw in the video, and new extremes have to be met in order to get the same effect. So it's like we're always chasing that high. And in your books, there's a definition of tolerance. So eventually the fill-in is tolerance can build to the point that the addictive behavior no longer even provides pleasure. You're really just doing it to avoid withdrawal. So with that said, I've shared some of the science. And remember, we're just touching on the surface. This is a huge topic, but I'd like you to think about on page 11, one or two things maybe you've heard before or you want to tap into, you want to remember, because we tend to remember what we reflect on and write down. So just take a moment. And then if you had an aha moment, think about that and put that in your workbook and be prepared to share it in the chat.
Introduce Tracy Lee.
Okay, so if you would start posting things that stood out for you, if anything did, I'm hoping something stood out for you, and maybe an aha moment if you have that, and share it. And then if there's hands raised and you're willing to speak out, I'd like to spend a couple minutes sharing. I've got, it's not an arbitrary choice, a remapping of the brain. The brain is responsible for initiating and controlling everything. Dopamine levels pretty striking. No kidding. When I saw that, I'm like, no wonder I was hijacked. Here, once the addicted person's brain changes, it's difficult for the person to listen or get motivated to make a change. You guys got it. I've never heard tolerance explained that way. I love these comments. Keep them coming. Thanks, everyone. This is a great lead in because we're going to talk about recovery next. I'm going to leave you with this thought as we leave the science of addiction.